summer, because it's pitta season, right? It's more fire and water. It's going to aggravate pitta that is within us, right? So it's going to then increase those qualities, and it can cause all kinds of symptoms if it goes out of balance within us. And each of us is different, right? Each of us, you have a certain amount of pitta. I have a different amount of pitta. Everyone who's listening has different amounts of pitta. We all have pitta within us, right? Now, depending on how much we have, that's how much we can tolerate, right? So someone who has a lot of pitta, or maybe pitta is a dominant dosha for them, their ability to really regulate in the summer is a little bit harder. And it's really important, because if they even get a little too much pitta inside of them, which already has a lot of pitta, they're going to go out of balance and they're going to have symptoms, right? So as soon as you start to go out of balance, you start to have, the signs of sort of aggravated pitta, things like you mentioned, right? Increased sweating, lots of heat. Really, you can imagine it's like fire trying to come out of the body. That's what's trying to happen, right? So it's going to show up as inflammation. So lots of injuries. It can show up as acidity. So you can have acid reflux, skin rashes, right? Literally, heat's trying to come out of the body and through the skin. The skin's the largest organ of the body. You might have acne. You might have heat rashes, lots of irritability and anger, right? These are all the things, if you think about it, those are all fiery types of symptoms that are trying to escape from the body. So again, when you have too much pitta, pitta on pitta, so a pitta person in a pitta season, and then you add pitta activities and pitta foods, it's a disaster. It's just a lot of heat, right? So I'm giving these visuals because I think it's so important for people to understand why it's so important then to do so many of the lifestyle changes that we talk about and dietary changes in the summer, or as we're going from one season to the next. You start to understand, you're like, I need to counterbalance. I need to balance out the things that I am doing in my everyday life so that I don't have that overload of pitta. I don't have that accumulation and then all those symptoms. So that's kind of really the why of why it's so important, and then also how it correlates to pitta and the pitta dosha.
It makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that, this is why I'm so excited for Ayurveda to spread more, especially here in North America, because I think about summer, especially the past couple of years, there's been a lot of conflict in our culture, and I think it is because of this pent up, fiery energy. So
Mm-hmm.
talk to me about the very tangible things that we can be doing to cool that off, and to
Mm-hmm.
really change the internal dynamic and help ourselves really regulate is what's coming to mind. It's like, especially in a climate that, let's be honest, is getting hotter and hotter, we've
Yep.
really got to be conscious of what we can be doing to regulate ourselves.
Yeah. And so really it comes back to a certain couple things. And, you know, I will give you some ideas of specific things you can do. But I think, again, I'm always about understanding the principles, because that way you can sort of regulate yourselves on a daily basis without actually remembering the exact things. You'll understand the principle. So again, if we go back to this idea of opposites reduce, right? Like increases like, opposites reduce. We know that we want to do the opposite thing. So what we're trying to do is balance out this fire and this water that are the two elements of pitta, right? And so a couple of things that we can do is we want to balance out the heat, but we also want to make sure that we have enough moisture, right? Enough hydration. So a couple of things that we can do is really to think about, how do we cool down in the summer? Because the heat is the major issue that always affects most people, especially, as you said, as the climate is changing, in the world. We're seeing all the effects of that. I mean, this week in Chicago, it's 100 degrees.
Oh, wow.
Literally, it's anywhere from 90 to 100 degrees. We have never had that where it's been consistently like that at the beginning of June. I
Mhm.
mean, we know that something's happening in the climate. So how do we keep ourselves cool? Well, there's a couple things we can do. We can do it with diet, right? We'll talk about dietary changes. So you really want to think about foods that are cooling, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. And again, go by what nature is doing. Nature's providing all these beautiful, like you said at the picnic that you were with at, your kids, all the watermelon and cucumbers and that was all to help us cool down. So you really want to increase those cooling foods in your diet. You want to stay hydrated. These are very simple things, drink cooling beverages, not iced beverages, but cooling ones. Add cooling spices, whether it's peppermint or fennel or aloe, right? These are all things that are very cooling to the body. Fruit juice if you need to in the summer. And then another thing is to really make sure that you cool off and your environment, really spend time in cool, shaded areas. You want to avoid that excessive sun exposure in the middle of the day. Now, these are things that we've all grown up knowing, right? Our parents told us to do this when we were young, but now you understand why. There's a very tangible why, because we want to make sure we're balancing out that heat of summer. So those are some of the things that we can do with cooling. Hydration, right? Easy things. Make sure that you're drinking plenty of water. Make sure you're eating those hydrating foods that have a high water content. You can add something like aloe vera to your diet that will help to cool. So those are some of the specific cooling and hydrating practices that you can do. Is that
Hmm. It's interesting. So I was experiencing, like I said, some kind of like gut stuff the last couple weeks, and intuitively there were two things that I started doing. The first was I bought aloe vera and I started kind of incorporating it into my smoothies, and my
Mhm.
smoothies have been turning to fresher, like not frozen berries, but now I'm getting fresh
Right.
berries because they're on sale in the market, and I'm like,
Mhm.
I've got to, eat them while they're fresh, kind of thing. And then the other thing I started doing was chia water is like a thing that I like when I my
Mhm.
belly gets a little, unsettled, is I'll add, my kids call it frog water, because I'll add lime juice and chia seeds, and
Yeah.
obviously then when they plump up, they look kind of like
Mhm.
frog eggs, and so they'll be like,
Mhm.
"Oh, mom's drinking her frog water." But both of those things I now
Mhm.
know are cooling and kind of settling my system.
Right.
Um, and I'm laughing because I have it sitting here right now.
Yeah, no, those are all things that are helpful. I mean, think about the things that, maybe your parents or your grandparents would make in the summer. There's a reason they were doing that. It was all to provide this hydration, to provide this cooling. That was the reason they were doing those things. And they were using things that were available in nature. Mother Nature is a lot smarter than we are. She
Mhm,
provides what we need during the different seasons. So in the summer, it's all these cooling herbs and spices, cooling fruits and vegetables, right? Um, to increase that hydration and to cool our bodies down and our minds
mhm,
also. So those are some important things. Some other things that you can do as far as routines go, because we're going to get to the dietary components in a minute. I know that that's a really commonly asked question. So we're going to do a whole question about that. But like seasonal routines, right? So the morning routine that you can do, and this is really, again, to pacify that pitta, to bring that pitta, that fire into balance. A morning routine, things like if you're doing a self massage in the morning, some abhyanga, which, is a practice in Ayurveda to help settle the nervous system, to pull out toxins from the body. You want to use cooling oils in the summer, things like coconut oil or sunflower oil. Those are a lot more cooling, and you want to follow that with like a very lukewarm shower. No hot showers, hot baths, things like that. Again, cooling, but you're changing the kind of oil you're using in the
mhm,
practice that you're doing. Exercise, like you said, you don't want to be doing these high intensity hikes. If you're going to do them at the cooler times of the day, in the morning or in the evening, not in the middle of the day. That's just going to overheat you, increase your pitta, cause all sorts of, injuries. I always tell this, this story. When I first started practicing Ayurveda and actually consulting, I had quite a few patients who would come to me who are really, really athletic, like athletes who, marathon all summer, especially in Chicago. It's marathon season here, right?
mhm,
And they were doing all these marathons and they'd come in with all these injuries. because they were highly competitive, right? Because they're running these races. They have a lot of pitta in them. It's pitta season and they're doing pitta activities.
Oh,
It just was, again, a recipe for increased injuries, increased inflammation, right? So if you're doing those kinds of exercise, if you're doing like intense running, marathoning, biking, all those things, do them in the morning and the evening, not in the middle of the
mhm,
day. So you could instead do some, a little bit gentler exercise, maybe some swimming or walking, again, early morning, late in the evening, that type of thing when the temperatures are cooler. So you want to shift your exercise. And then, the rest and relaxation. Summer is a really fun time to be outdoors, to be with family, to be with friends. There's tons of things going on. Avoid the sort of the need to do everything all the time because that increases the amount of fire, the amount of pitta. So you want to balance that out with some rest, some relaxation, some downtime, some space, right? That needing to slow down that we all feel in the summer, don't like fight that urge because there's so much to do. So
yeah.
those are some things to think about routines.
That's the I feel like you just set down the gauntlet for me. That's the challenge I wanna put forward for myself because I feel like last summer and partially it was because we were in a smaller home, and so we just needed to get out, like, but
Mhm.
it was that push because there's so much that happens during summer. I felt like every night we were at, concert in the park or going to the movie or play date
Exactly.
or trip or this or that, and you just kinda end up feeling a bit ragged, like,
Right.
versus this summer I'm like, okay, like laying in the yard on a blanket. I'm gonna stack up some good books. I'm
Mhm.
gonna take a couple weeks off. Like, that those are the changes I'm trying to shift and see in my life this summer because, otherwise you just kind of like careen into fall and it kind of
Yep.
feels like a really hard crash, especially when the kids went back to school and things like that.
Exactly, exactly. And then all that pitta is accumulated and you're going to have symptoms at the end of the summer too. So
Yeah.
it's all about balancing. It's not saying that you shouldn't do those things because actually summer is that time of sort of that joy, that joie de vivre, it's sort of like that, time to be playful and light. And so doing those things, going to the park, seeing the movie in the park, going to the concerts, those are all really important because it taps into that playful energy of summer. But at the same time, it's really important to regulate that, to make
Mhm.
sure that you're balancing that with the rest and relaxation that creates that cooling sort of that time to just bring it down a little bit. That's important in the summer too. So
Mm.
I really
Mm.
like what you're saying about balancing that out.